Good morning or afternoon to those that are on the other coast and other places besides the Pacific Coast. Welcome to FSMA Fridays. My name is Jill Bender with Safety Chain Software. Delighted to host today's session. It should be actually a very lively session given the recent final rules that just came out. And we will just get going. We've had quite a few pre-submitted questions, and I expect a very lively session. We are going to be taking questions, so you can go ahead and put questions in the Q&A tab as we are going through everything. So just before we begin, a couple housekeeping tips. A recording link, as always, will be sent out on Monday. As mentioned, we encourage questions, so go ahead and submit those into the Q&A tab. For your privacy, we do have everyone's names not showing, but as suspected, given all the activity going on right now, we have quite the crowd logging in today, so very excited about that. And then finally, I always like to mention, if you're having trouble hearing the audio through your speakers, which is automatic, there is a call-in number, and you can find that in the Event tab within the WebEx platform, so I highly encourage you just to call in. So with that, we will go ahead and go through our pre-submitted questions, and we will then take your questions. So today I'm delighted, as always, to have Dr. Acheson with us this morning. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Jill.
And then also a warm welcome to Rolando Gonzalez, also with the Acheson Group team. He's been a part of FSMA Fridays, but this will be the first time he's on the other side with us as a panelist, and very informative topics he'll be talking about as well. Good morning, Rolando.
Good morning, Jill. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and get the show started. The first question we always start with, and a loaded question for today, of course, right? But let's go ahead and share what the latest is, David.
Yeah, loaded question, exactly. Well, I think everybody on the call knows what the latest is. We've got a couple new rules to talk about, which have now gone final, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about. The only other point that I would mention is I have heard nothing further about any shifts in dates for the next round. They're due on Halloween, October 31st. I've not heard any movement on that, so assuming all is on track for that, but that'll about hit our next FSMA Friday. So no, I think with that, Jill, let's just dive in.
Absolutely. So again, we'll be all about the preventive control rules for human animal food that were announced, the final rules. So let's sort of just take a moment to discuss what are the major changes from the previous drafts, and of that, what are the major requirements for compliance?
Yeah, are you directing that question to me?
I am, please.
Okay, all right, sorry. Fundamentally, these rules haven't changed a whole lot from the proposed rules. I think I've said all along that I didn't think we'd see massive changes, and we haven't. I think again, as we've discussed in the past, the statute which was published, signed by the President in 2011, was pretty specific. The proposed rules reflected that. The final rules have reflected the proposed rules. I think what's important is, and we'll get into that obviously in this webinar, is getting into some of the major shifts, if there are any, some of the nuances, and like I've said, I don't think there are major shifts. And fundamentally, what a food company is going to need to do is, if they are required to register, and there's been some tweaks and I think clarifications at the farm end, which I think will be helpful. It's still complex, and to be frank, I haven't completely got my head around all of that yet. But if you are required to register, then you will have to put together a food safety plan, just like we've said before. The major components of that plan are no different. We have to analyze the hazards. We've got to identify the risks. We have to control the risks. We have to monitor that those controls are working. We have to do the corrective actions, verify that the process is up and running, maintain the records, and reanalyze periodically. Just as we expected, environmental monitoring is in there. That's part of the overall risk assessment approach. I know we're going to talk about that in a bit more depth in a second. And the supply chain control is in there. Again, a few nuances, a few changes around that that we can get into. But at a very high level, Jill, these rules are much as we've seen before. I think another interesting point that that's been made, and we can dig into this a bit more, is that FDA have acknowledged the fact that a lot of establishments are becoming GFSI certified. And the question, so what does that mean? Does that mean if you're GFSI, you are completely compliant and don't need to worry about it? And my read of the final rule is that's not what they're saying. They're basically saying you are a long way to being there, and you may need to just look for some gaps and fill them. So I think, once again, being GFSI certified is going to put people in a good place for compliance with these rules. Obviously, on this webinar and subsequent ones, we will continue to dive into more details on these various components. And so let me just, in the interest of moving this through so we can get to callers' questions, let me just stop there and summarize it by saying, if you are familiar with the proposed rules, you're going to be 99% there on the final rules, because they really didn't change all that much. Back to you.
Okay, great. And we should have had the bet on that one, because you've been saying that all along, right, as far as not too much change. So that was good to hear. Moving on to the next question, and we'll go ahead and ask Rolando to go ahead and address this one. What approach is FDA taking with regard to assessing risk for FSMA?
Yes, that's actually a very good question. And what they are requiring the industry to do is to employ this framework known now as HARP-C, of hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. So pretty much conducting a hazard analysis to determine if there are any known or reasonably foreseeable biological, chemical, or physical hazards, or any hazards that could be introduced with the purpose of economic gain, in what's known as economically motivated adulteration. And the aim of that is pretty much to determine if there are any that require a preventive control. Some of the factors that you need to consider when evaluating or assessing this risk, it's the severity of the illness or injury, the probability of it occurring in the absence of the preventive controls, the environment in which the food is being processed, including the facility, the equipment, the formulation of the food, of course, the nature of the ingredients, the intended use, and so forth. And one of those, which David touched a little bit on, is the evaluation of environmental pathogens, particularly if it's a ready-to-eat food that it's being exposed to the environment before it's packaged. So considering all these different elements, companies need to come up with a list of hazards that then they will determine if any of those, based on this criteria, require a preventive control. This might change, so it's not a one-time thing that you don't revisit with some frequency, and that actually could trigger a reanalysis of the food safety plan sooner than the minimum of the every 3 years required frequency. So that's pretty much how they are approaching the assessment of risk at this point.
This is David. I think that's a great answer, Rolando. I think just a couple of other points that just to pull out, which gets back to the comment I made about minimal changes. Those of you who've been tracking the history of FSMA will remember that the first definition of hazards was very sort of HACCP-centric, hazard reasonably likely to occur. And then in the reproposal, we shifted it, or they shifted it, I should say, to significant hazard, and everybody said, well, what's significant hazard? And now the FDA has shifted it again, and obviously this is the final shift, to, quote, hazards requiring a preventive control. So it's like, all right, everybody's scratching their head about that. And they haven't really shifted what that means, but just kind of in the interest of diving a little deeper into this, a hazard requiring a preventive control, and I'm sort of somewhat quoting from what they said here, is a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard for which a person knowledgeable about the safe manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of food would, based on the outcome of a hazard analysis, establish one or more preventive controls. So this gets back to the qualified individual, and there's a little tweak there too, because they've they've introduced a new term of a preventive control qualified individual. So there really is an expectation that companies have got the inside or outside knowledge to a level that allows them to do this, a hazard requiring a preventive control. And so I think, it's clarification to some extent as to exactly what this means, but it is still up to the judgment of a person or who's writing the food safety plan. And that does create an Achilles heel, I think, because what I see as a hazard maybe not quite what Rolando sees as a hazard, particularly if it's in a borderline area, and then may be different from a third person, and maybe different yet again from an FDA inspector. So I think it's going to be important for companies when they make a determination that it's not a hazard, not so much that it is. If it's not, so what's the rationale behind that? And so that it can be explained to an inspector if they show up. So anyway, just another thought that triggered from what Rolando was saying.
And that's great, Dave. And one last thing that I want to add about that is that the FDA is also developing guidance for the industry to help with, identifying some of these more obscure, not obscure, but, gray areas, like you were saying, that may be subject to interpretation.
Right. Perfect.
Okay.
So, Jill, what's up next?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I know a few questions will probably come from that, and that you talked quite a bit the last FSMA Friday session about the whole qualified individual, and I find it interesting that they've added preventive control in front of that, for sure. So let me go ahead and move us to the next question, and I'm going to go ahead and have David, why don't you go ahead and follow up on this one. Is FDA still requiring environmental controls? And then as an add-on, what should companies do to meet the requirements?
Yes, they are. And much as I said in my opening comments, this one hasn't really changed at all. They are requiring environmental controls. The expectation is that you roll it into your food safety plan. It has not changed from the basic principles that we've talked about in the past about essentially it's in that situation where a product is being manufactured in an environment where it's moving from a processing, i.e. a kill step, into a finished package, and is then not subsequently treated in that finished package to kill any potential hazards or remove any potential hazards. So that really hasn't fundamentally changed around the basic requirement. And as we've said again before, Jill, this is good practices, or within a food company, or even best practices, is to have a really robust environmental control program. We're continuing every week to see situations emerge from Salmonella and Listeria that have got into products that are ready to eat in the environment. So irrespective of where FSMA takes us on this, my view of everything that I've read so far in the final rules about this and the comments around it is that the FDA is not asking us to do anything that a good company wouldn't want to do anyway to protect their risks. So some companies will have to do more, but frankly, my view is they probably should be anyway. And so this one hasn't changed a great deal. It is about building that environmental monitoring program, and as should have said up front, right through all of this, it's records. It's all about keeping track of what you're doing. Everything needs to be written down, and everything needs to be collected because the agency can look at it and ask to see whether your environmental control program, like all your other programs, is working. So we probably need a whole webinar on establishing an environmental monitoring program, so maybe we'll do that down the road a little bit. But at this high level for this first one, it hasn't changed, and the basic premise is making a ready-to-eat food that's exposed, not further processed in its final package. You need a program. That's basically what they're saying.
Okay, great, thank you. And I've noted as far as an expansion on this topic for future sessions. Moving on to the next question. What approach is FDA taking for supply chain controls? And Rolando, why don't you help us out with this question?
Sure, Jill. Yeah, so there's actually a long section within the final rule devoted to the supply chain program, which includes supply approval and verification activities. And the reason for that is because FDA wants to provide flexibility to the industry for accommodating some of the variety of activities that are already taking place and that are effective in controlling the typical hazards within the supply chain. So it does apply to manufacturing and processing facilities, not warehouses in this case, and it requires them to have a supply chain program to ensure the control of the hazards in raw materials and other ingredients, particularly when the control is applied before the receipt of those materials. And that's what they call the supply chain applied controls. One thing that we have to clarify here is the definition of supplier. Who in the final rule is not just who buy the entity who buys the food, but it's pretty much the establishment that processes, manufactures the food, raises an animal, grows the food, and that is provided then to the manufacturer without further intervention by anybody else within the chain. Give you an example of that. For example, a broker or a distributor is not a supplier, but it's somebody before them who does exactly what I just said. The requirements themselves, again, the materials must be received from approved suppliers. Sometimes there is, provisions for unapproved suppliers on a temporary basis, but the materials should be subjected to verification before use. There's a number of verification activities that need to happen along with that, and that includes the combination of one or more of these on-site audits, sampling and testing, review of food safety records, and other activities as appropriate to the nature of the hazard and the food that is being handled. The activity and the frequency of those hazards also needs to be based on that nature of the hazard, entity controlling the hazard, and the supplier performance, based on the history that the manufacturer has had with that supplier in regards to response to corrective actions, based on potentially import alerts or warnings letters from the FDA. So all of that needs to be considered. One additional point in regards to on-site audits is that those are considered the most appropriate verification activities for hazards that may cause serious adverse health consequences or death. And this is the SACOTA term that they coined in the proposed rule. These on-site audits need to be performed by a qualified auditor, which is pretty much an individual who has the technical expertise, either through education or experience, or a combination of those to perform the auditing function. And in the final rule, they provide for that person to be a government employee, it could be a third-party service provider, it could be an employee of the receiving manufacturing facility. It could actually be another entity within the supply chain, such as, thinking along the lines of second-party audits. And there is also other verification activities are less frequent auditing that can happen if the manufacturing facility can justify the adequacy of them in, in controlling the hazard. One provision that was also included in the final rule is that regulatory inspections at the federal, state, or even local level may substitute for one of these audits, as long as they've been conducted within the 1 year or the period, required that the original audit would have been required. Yeah, it's actually, it may sound a little complex, but it's, again, because of the FDA wanting to allow the industry more flexibility along the lines of supply chain controls.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just as a reminder, we are recording this. We do send out a recording link, and a lot of great information is being shared here today. So just wanted to let you know, for those fast and fiercely taking notes, you absolutely will be getting a link to the recording. So moving on, and now, David, I know you touched on this already in sort of the kickoff, but again, let's just sort of come back to this as far as from a GFSI compliance. Has the FDA determined that that is equivalent to a FSMA compliance?
Right. No, and I did mention it, Jill, as you say, and I mentioned it because it's a question that is coming up all the time. And there are a lot of companies that obviously are GFSI compliant, an increasing number due to a variety of reasons, and this is an obvious question. So the FDA did specifically address this, and what they have said is that basically to the extent that an existing plan, and they don't just say GFSI, I mean they actually mention a HACCP plan. So if you have an existing HACCP plan or a GFSI compliant food safety plan, and you can use that to meet the requirements of the rule. And but it does say that, and you're relying on the existing records. But they make it very clear that you may have to supplement as necessary to demonstrate compliance with the new preventive control rules. Now, to me, they've called it out and said, because so many people were asking the question, and I think they've basically told us what they're thinking. My view of this is that it really isn't any different from what we've been saying all along, is that if you are GFSI compliant, you are a long way to meeting the preventive control rules. And many of our colleagues on the phone will know that we at TAG have done comparative analysis. We've looked at some of the major GFSI standards and done the comparison. How do they shape up against the proposed preventive control rules? And they shaped up pretty well. And that's common information. And so really what FDA is saying is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. They're saying you've got a HACCP plan, use it. You've got GFSI compliant records and systems, use them. And which is really what we've been saying all along. But they make the important point, and probably the key words, as with supplementation as necessary to demonstrate compliance with the requirements of the human preventive control rules. So to me, that means just because you're GFSI certified, you can't relax. You've absolutely got to look at your program and say, does this translate one for one to the preventive control rule requirements? Is there something in the PC rule that I'm not doing, that I should be doing to be compliant, even though I've got my GFSI certificate? It may be a nuance, it may be a tweak, but they are really saying, don't reinvent the wheel, use what you've got, but make sure that you supplement it as you need to. So the good news is that they've, I think, significantly clarified their view on GFSI, which is good, so we know where we stand. I call it bad news. I think it was predictable news. Is they basically saying GFSI today does not equal compliance with preventive control rule. It might if you've got all the components in there and you've got a few bells and whistles, but it doesn't automatically give you a pass. You've got to go and do the due diligence and check up on it. So that's my read of what they're saying about GFSI, Jill.
Okay, great. It sounds, very similar to what you've been talking about just in general of identifying the gaps, right, of your current plans and getting up to the next level to meet FSMA. So the same would hold.
Yeah, I should have placed some odds on me being right. I'd cleaned up pretty well.
It was a good odds, but then you wouldn't be joining us for these FSMA Fridays, so I'm glad you didn't do that. And I'll just add just a quick little note there to this point. Safety Chain does have a series. It's actually kicking off today at 10 o'clock, right after, which it does with the major GFSI schemes, where they are talking specifically how they align with FSMA, but also where the areas that they might not be complete alignment. And the first one today is with SQF, and David will call out, I know it's on one of the slides, it shows the analysis that you had done with them, so they'll be going through that today at our 10 o'clock session. So moving on to what looks like one of the last questions that were pre-submitted, and let's see, let's go ahead and, David, let me have you just wrap up here. And again, you've been talking about this throughout all these different questions, but if there's anything more you want to add on as far as, what to prepare for the preventive control rule compliance.
Yeah, no, sure. And let me just throw out a couple of high-level thoughts and then ask Rolando if what further he'd add to this. we've been saying all along is get your team together. We've now got final rules. Make sure you know how they pertain to you. Look at the foods that you're producing and how the FDA is saying that you might need more than one food safety plan depending on the different types of products and systems that you've got in place. Look at what you've got. Look at your HACCP plans. Look at your GFSI systems if you are GFSI certified, and figure out where those gaps are so you can fill in those blanks if you need to. And then fundamentally, I think, ask yourself the question, if you are a large plant, and let me just put a parens on that, FDA didn't really change the definitions of size of plant, very small, 1 million down. Small is less than 500 people, and everybody else falls into the big plant, big facility bucket. And they're if you're one of those large guys, you've got to be compliant in 1 year, 2 years for the small, 3 years for the very small. So that didn't change. But get ready to answer the question when the agency shows up, the inspector shows up and says, show me your food safety plan. What are you going to do? I've said it before. I think that's a really important question that the person in the plant needs to be able to answer. And if you're doing that, and how are you going to be able to demonstrate compliance, that you get it, then that's what companies should be preparing for, frankly, is how am I going to answer that question? What am I going to give the inspector when they show up? So let me kick it over to Rolando, see if he's got any thoughts on what further companies should do.
Yeah, absolutely, David. So I think the recommendation here is that companies start working on it now or continue working on it now. We're seeing a lot of companies, trying to be ahead of the game and pretty much be proactive about this and work on it and not just wait until next year until it gets close to compliance date. Like you said, I mean, most companies will have 1 year from September 17th to comply with the rule. And there could be some areas which may require some additional work depending on the status of the company at the moment. So I would say just general recommendation, start or continue working on it right now.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So with that, what we're going to go ahead and do is I'm going to take us out of full screen. And looks like quite a few questions have come in already, but the Q&A tab is now open for those that are online with us. You can go ahead and submit questions, and we'll start taking those. And what I'd like to do is just also share very briefly about Safety Chain and how Safety Chain can help you with managing FSMA compliance. I'm going to take back to what, Dave, what you said earlier about it's all about keeping records. You said it 3 times, and that's a large component of what Safety Chain can help out with. But our food safety and quality management tools provides for more of the full picture. So once you've already, determined your food safety plan and compliance and the components of it, our automation tools help you manage that, monitor, verify that's being completed, and then that last part about documentation and be able to show that, your plans, the maintenance of your program, the proof that all the pieces have been completed, whether it's your CAPAs, your preventive controls, all those components. And then most importantly, take the level up, and especially for those with GFSI certification, is you now have data, because it's all part of a centralized system for continuous improvement, trending, and reporting. So that incorporates our system, but it all comes down to once you have your plan developed and then applying it and managing it within a system like Safety Chain helps with compliance and makes you, more importantly, audit ready. So that's just sort of the brief component about Safety Chain. For anyone who has further questions, we're happy to take those offline. But I just wanted to mention that. So let's go ahead and dive into the questions that have come in. And again, there are quite a few, so I'm just going to start putting those out there. A couple questions that have come in that I'm going to tie together is really just a question of where can we see the final rule. So people are starting to ask, okay, I have specific questions around those rules. I want to physically be able to see those. And there's been questions or concerns about not being able to easily access that. David, can you advise?
Yeah, they're on the FDA FSMA website,
right.
And you know, if these are questions that people are asking like right now, then I am going to post them right on our front page, on our homepage, on our site. We will get those up today, so that there are actually two versions of the rules, and they are the same. Although I will confess I have not read both from one end to the other. One of them is the original version that came out September 17th, I think it was, which is a straight double-spaced PDF-type file. It's 930 pages long. About a week later, the agency came out with the Federal Register version. It's word for word the same, but it's 262 pages long, but it's in the classic 3-column Federal Register-type format. So depending which one you want, they are both searchable, they're both PDFs, but they are available on the FDA website. But whoever asked that question, I agree with them. It's like, where the heck is it? And I had to dig around to find them. It's not screamingly obvious, but I will take that. So if you check on achesongroup.com a little bit later today, we will get those up on our homepage, and so they'll be. I'll have them posted as 4 versions, the 930-page version and the 262-page version, and you can take your pick for human and animal.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know sometimes the government sites can be very crazy trying to dig out resources. I'm going to go ahead and follow up that question, which is a definite follow-up to this, and more importantly is the question along the lines of, okay, 930 pages, 267 pages, what resources are available to help us either review what we currently have and identify the gaps as sort of where the direction was going that Susan was asking, or more importantly, is there online courses? I know FSPCA has talked about that, or what other resources are available to help with this?
Yeah, I think, well, from a federal perspective, I haven't seen any. Other than what they're posting on the websites, and Rolando mentioned earlier that there'll be guidance documents coming out, which will certainly help. There is the training center that you mentioned, which is absolutely getting online and going live, so there'll be the opportunity to get training. And then I think there's going to be any number of, obviously, outside groups putting together webinars, educational opportunities. But you know, what's key, I think, is going to be to translate this really down into concrete. So what does this mean to me? As a food company, I've got my HACCP plan. I may or may not be GFSI certified. What do I actually have to do to be able to answer David's question of what am I going to give the FDA inspector when he shows up and asks to see my food safety plan, which is going to demonstrate that I'm compliant with all these new rules and regulations. It's a matter of just looking at what's being put out by webinars from trade associations, from private groups, what the FDA is going to do with their outreach and their public meetings, and then this training program. Right now, there isn't a very, what would I say, coherent and coordinated response on how to do it, but it is out there, and it's going to grow, I'm sure, quite substantially in the next month or two.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question, again, I'm sort of grouping a few questions that have come in, and again, it's around this one, HACCP, and we've touched on this, but a few people are asking, you know, HACCP is you know, a large component, right, is preventive controls. So, you know, what's the difference from the FSMA preventive controls? And you know, and again, this was sort of addressed quite a bit in our last session, but if you want to, you know, David, Rolando, either one to sort of address that.
Yeah, Rolando, why don't you give that a shot?
Yeah, sure. So Jill, in that case, you know, it's a more holistic approach in the case of Hart C than it was HACCP. Pretty much, you know, considering not just CCPs, but also what other interventions. Think about prerequisite programs, for example. The hazard that has been identified as in other words, it's not the CCPs, but it's also integrating everything else that companies have already been doing to support the effectiveness of a HACCP program. And then there's a shift in terminology, of course. These become now what's called preventive controls, and they can include controls, they can include CCP. Difference between the two.
Okay, great. Melandra, you still there?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
I'm sorry. You cut a little out on my end, so hopefully that wasn't the case for the whole audience. I didn't mean to cut you off if you're still talking on that one. And again, the recording will come out. So I'm sorry, were you complete with that, or did you have anything more to add? Oops, I think we might have lost you. David, are you still there?
I'm still here, yeah, yep.
Okay, sorry. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and go to the next question. We'll come back to it if we need to. Next question is a little more specific is, how does FSMA impact suppliers of packaging materials?
That is, I haven't seen anything that's any different, but that's a good question. I need to research that, see if they've said anything specifically different. But the way FSMA was originally written was looking at risks. That, to me, that included risks associated with food contact, and that would include primary packaging. So the receiving facility using the package would need to determine if there's risks associated with that packaging. And again, these risks that somebody knowledgeable in the space would want to control. And if there are, they would need to control them, and they would be pushing back on their packaging suppliers, obviously, to control those risks. I see those, frankly, as chemical risks more than anything else, of the potential of materials, chemicals, toxins leaking out of any packaging material. In some instances, it may be microbiological, it may be mold or other things. Packaging companies per se aren't going to have to be compliant with FSMA, is my read of it, but they are going to have to recognize that their primary packaging will have to be, and so arguably that they will have to be, if you're tracking with my thought process here. So I don't think a packaging company is going to have to put in a food safety plan. That's my read of it, and if I see anything different, I'd be sure to let everybody know. But their primary packaging will need to meet those requirements of not introducing a risk, which means they need to pay attention to that, which they do today anyway. So I suspect, I suspect they're not going to have much to do. They just need to be cognizant of their customers maybe saying, hey, we need to document that you are controlling this risk as part of supply chain risk control.
Okay, great, thank you. And and I just was looking at the time. I know we've been entrenched in questions, but quite a few people have chatted with me to indicate they had to log off. But again, so what I'll do is we'll stay on for about 5 more minutes to try to address quite a few more questions. But for those that do have to log off, thank you for joining us. Again, the recording link will be sent. You'll get an automatic reminder for the October session, which is tentatively right now produce rule, but we'll see. We might mix that up based on what's coming out, what makes sense. Also, just a reminder, plenty of resources, safety chain with our GFSI series that kicks off today with SQF, and be sure to check out the Acheson Group's page. It sounds like later on today they're going to make it very easy for everyone to access the rules, as well as tag is a great resource for helping you out with FSMA and gap analysis and trainings and so forth. So always encourage you to check out their site as well on a regular basis. So I'm going to go ahead and get back to these questions. Again, we have about 5 more minutes here, and then we will take some of the other questions offline and try to address them hopefully in the next few sessions. So one, I think, I'm going to combine a few, and people are talking about from if they have to be compliant with it under FSMA. This particular one was indicating they're a small plant, under 500 people. However, their individual plant is part of a larger corporation. Do they still need to be compliant if they're just an individual plant, less than 500?
Yeah, I saw that question pop up. What's the definition of a small business?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And the FDA are using the definition from the Small Business Administration. And to quote from the final rule, FDA saying, we propose to define the term small business to mean a business employing fewer than 500 persons. And the question there is, how do you define a business? And I think we might have to go back, and I haven't done it, to the Small Business Administration's definitions of a business. But my interpretation of this is that if you are an entity, a business operating under one management structure or one ownership structure, and you've got 2 facilities, and each one of those facilities has 251 employees in it, you would have a total of 502, and you would be deemed to be not a small business. So I think they're going to roll it up. To me, a business does not mean a facility. This is not facility specific, it's not site specific, it's business specific. So if you're trading under one name, you'd have to look at all your employees, and it's really, again, talking about full-time employee equivalents. So that's my interpretation of this, is that it's a roll-up to the corporation level, looking at essentially everything underneath it. But there's a whole bunch of comments on this one. And for those of you who want to go check it out, it's on the Federal Register version. It's on page 56. There's a bunch of comments and responses around the definition of a small business.
Now, David, I picture you having 900 pages sitting on your desk right now, and the fact that you're able to say page 56 is great. Killed a couple trees for this one. A couple other questions come in, and I know we touched on this as well, but again, when does the timeline for compliance start? Publication date or effective date was specifically the question.
Oh, I think we have to assume it's publication date. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, publication date. So for what that's worth, that's bought us another 16 days.
Right. So not a lot of difference is that. And I know, again, we touched on this last session, but a few people are asking as far as, that doesn't apply for everyone, right? So there's sort of a tiered approach. It's the large percentage for the first year. But if you can just touch on that as well, I would appreciate it.
I'm sorry, who's going to be?
So the question is, as far as compliance, so, it's a tiered approach, right? Isn't it the first year is a large percentage of the audience, and then after that, there's layers. So there's more.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
I'll take that.
Rolando, you take that one.
Yes. So the businesses with 500 or more FTEs, full-time equivalent employees, these are the large companies, September 19, 2016. That is the compliance date. There is a portion of the rule, which is a supply chain program, which has until later, March 17th of 2017, or pretty much 6 months after a supplier is required to comply with the applicable rule. Then for small businesses, it's going to be a year, an additional year, so September 18th of 2017. And then again, the supply chain program has a little more up until September 18 of 2017. For PMO businesses, anyone regulated by the or following the pasteurized milk ordinance, they have 2 years, an additional 2 years from 2016. So pretty much September 17th of 2018. And that is to allow the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments and some efforts that they're conducting to align with the Preventive Control requirements. And then the last one, pretty much the qualified facilities of the very small businesses, they have up until September 17th of 2018, so 3 years from now, pretty much for compliance required.
Okay, great. And again, we'll send the recording, and we also might even put out a blog post about that to sort of encapsulate that time frame, which I know is also posted out there. So with that, it is 15 minutes to the hour. There are quite a few questions. We will take them offline, try to incorporate them also into subsequent sessions moving forward. There was one comment that did come in that I thought was worthy to mention, and thank you, Susan, for submitting it. She had learned from another person about the 930-page report that had mentioned that the 100 pages at the back is really the meat of the rule. So I don't know if you find that as true, Rolando and David, but I thought that was an interesting comment because I could just imagine people are like 930 pages, so I just wanted to throw that out there. is a comment that came in.
Good comment. Yeah, absolutely. No, dead right. It's just a little fraction at the back where it actually gets into the specifics of the rule. The rest of it is preamble and comment and discussion. It's interesting reading as to why they've made the decisions they've made. When it comes down to what have I got to do, it's a much, much shorter document. Yep.
A little more palatable for all those online today. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's session. Thank you so much, Rolando, for joining us for your first FSMA Friday session as a panelist. I really appreciate it. David, as always, thank you so much for your continued insights and helping navigate through all this for everyone online today. And be on the lookout for the recording. Be sure to visit the Acheson Group's website for continued resources as well as with safety chains, and we'll look forward to another lively discussion for FSMA Fridays in October. Thank you so much for everyone, and again, thank you to Rolando and David with the Acheson Group.
Thank you, Jill.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.